Imagine waking up one morning to discover that your greatest strength has become your most dangerous weakness. The very quality that makes you human, your ability to feel what others feel, to absorb their pain, to carry their burdens as if they were your own, has transformed into something that threatens to destroy not just you, but everyone around you. You are an empath. You've always been told this is a gift. People seek you out when they're drowning in their own darkness, drawn to your warmth like moss to a flame. You listen without judgment. You heal without asking for payment. You give until you have nothing left to give. But what happens when the giver finally breaks? What happens when the person who holds everyone else's pain reaches their breaking point? Picture this. You're standing in your kitchen, coffee mug trembling in your hands, and for the first time in your life, you feel something you've never felt before. Not sadness, not exhaustion, not even despair. You feel rage. Pure, unadulterated rage that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The same heart that once ached for a stranger's suffering now burns with a fury so intense it frightens you. The same mind that once sought to understand and forgive now fantasizes about revenge, about making others feel what you felt, about finally making them pay. This is the moment Carl Jung warned us about, the moment when the shadow of the empath emerges from the depths of the unconscious like a long-dormant volcano suddenly erupting. It's the psychological equivalent of a nuclear meltdown, where the very core of compassion becomes toxic, where love transforms into its opposite not gradually, but instantaneously, like matter meeting antimatter. But here's the terrifying truth that Jung understood and that modern psychology is only beginning to grasp. This isn't a breakdown. This is a breakthrough. This is the shadow finally demanding its due, the dark side of empathy that we've ignored, suppressed, and denied for so long that it has grown monstrous in the darkness of our unconscious minds. Think about it. How many empaths do you know who seem perpetually drained, who attract broken people like magnets attract metal shavings? How many givers have you met who smile through their tears, who apologize for existing, who would rather set themselves on fire than let someone else feel cold? They walk among us like emotional vampires in reverse. Instead of taking energy, they give it away until they're nothing but hollow shells wearing masks of perpetual kindness. And we celebrate this. We call them saints, healers, lightworkers. We tell them they're special, that they're here to save the world. But what we don't tell them, what we refuse to acknowledge, is that they're slowly dying inside, that their compassion is killing them one selfless act at a time. Jung saw this coming. He understood that the human psyche demands balance, that for every act of light there must be an acknowledgement of shadow, that for every moment of giving there must be a moment of receiving. He warned that when we suppress one half of our nature, it doesn't disappear, it grows stronger, more resentful, more dangerous in the darkness of our unconscious. The empath's shadow isn't just anger or selfishness. It's something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. It's the accumulated weight of every boundary never set, every no never spoken, every time they chose someone else's comfort over their own survival. It's the crystallized essence of every moment they betrayed themselves in service of others, every time they smiled when they wanted to scream, every time they absorbed someone else's poison and called it love. And when it finally emerges, when the empath finally snaps, it doesn't just affect them. It affects everyone who has ever taken their kindness for granted, everyone who has ever dumped their emotional garbage at the empath's feet and walked away feeling lighter while leaving the empath feeling heavier. This is Jung's darkest warning, the one that modern self-help culture desperately wants to ignore, that our greatest virtues, when taken to extremes, become our greatest vices. That the person who feels everything might one day decide to feel nothing at all. That the one who saves everyone might one day decide that everyone deserves to burn. The question isn't whether this will happen. The question is, are you ready to understand why it must happen? Are you prepared to look into the abyss of your own empathy and see what's looking back at you? Because once you do, you'll never be able to unsee it. Once you understand the true nature of the empath's shadow, you'll realize that everything you thought you knew about compassion, about kindness, about what it means to be a good person, was just the beginning of a much deeper, much darker truth. What happens next will change everything you believe about human nature, about the price of kindness, and about the dangerous dance between light and shadow that plays out in every empath's soul. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think, and once you start falling, there's no going back. To understand why empaths inevitably snap, we must first understand what creates an empath in the first place. Jung called it the wounded healer archetype, the person who learns to heal others because they themselves were broken early in life. But this is only the surface of a much deeper psychological wound that runs through the very fabric of human consciousness. The empath is born not from strength, but from survival. Picture a child growing up in a household where emotions are weapons, where love is conditional, where the very air crackles with unspoken tension. This child learns, with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of the drowning, how to read the emotional temperature of every room they enter. They develop what Jung called participation mystique, a psychological state where the boundaries between self and other become dangerously blurred. But here's where modern psychology gets it wrong. We celebrate this as emotional intelligence or high sensitivity, never questioning why a child would need to develop such hypervigilance in the first place. We don't ask what kind of environment would force a developing mind to become so exquisitely attuned to others' emotions that they lose touch with their own. We don't wonder what happens to a person's authentic self when their entire identity becomes wrapped up in managing other people's feelings. Nietzsche understood this dynamic when he wrote about the will to power and how it manifests in different forms. The empath's will to power isn't domination. It's the desperate need to control through giving, to feel valuable through being needed, to exist through being useful. They become what he called the slave morality personified, finding meaning not in their own strength, but in their ability to serve others' weaknesses. This is why the empath's identity becomes so dangerously fragile. They exist only in relation to others' pain. Remove the suffering people from their lives, and they don't know who they are. They become addicted to being needed, to being the savior, to being the one person who understands. But addiction, as any honest observer of human nature knows, always demands more. The empath needs bigger crises, deeper wounds, more broken people to feel alive. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experiences in the concentration camps, spoke of how meaning can be found even in the worst suffering. But he also warned of something darker, how some people become so identified with their suffering that they cannot imagine existing without it. The empath faces this same trap, but from the opposite direction. They become so identified with healing others' suffering that they cannot imagine existing without broken people to fix. Carl Jung's most profound insight into this phenomenon came through his concept of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we cannot accept, that we push into the unconscious where they grow in power and malevolence. For the empath, the shadow contains all the selfishness, all the anger, all the no's they never said, all the boundaries they never set. It contains their unlived life, their unspoken needs, their unexpressed rage at being everyone's emotional dumping ground. But the empath's shadow is particularly dangerous because it's been fed by nobility. Every time they chose someone else's comfort over their own needs, they told themselves they were being good, kind, spiritual. They turned their self-betrayal into a virtue, their self-neglect into a badge of honor. This is what Jung called inflation, when we identify so completely with our virtues that we become unconscious of our vices. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the way we lie to ourselves about our motivations, the way we pretend we have no choice when we actually do. The empath lives in a constant state of bad faith, pretending they have no choice but to help, no choice but to give, no choice but to absorb everyone else's pain. They tell themselves they're victims of their own compassion, when in reality they're addicted to the feeling of being needed. This is where the hidden problem reveals itself. The empath's giving isn't actually altruistic. It's a sophisticated form of control, a way of avoiding their own inner work by staying busy with everyone else's problems. They become what Arthur Schopenhauer called the hedgehog's dilemma, in human form, desperate for connection but unable to get close without causing pain, both to themselves and others. The tragic irony is that the empath's compulsive giving actually prevents genuine intimacy. People can't love someone they pity, can't respect someone who has no boundaries, can't trust someone who won't advocate for themselves. The empath becomes a magnet for users, manipulators, and emotional vampires precisely because they signal that they will accept any treatment as long as they're needed. Jung observed that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The empath attracts broken people not because they're a healer, but because they're broken in exactly the same way. They just express it through giving instead of taking. They're two sides of the same coin, the giver and the taker, locked in a deadly dance of codependency. This is why the empath's eventual snap is not just inevitable, it's necessary. It's the psyche's final desperate attempt to restore balance, to reclaim the abandoned parts of the self, to integrate the shadow that has been denied for so long. The snap is not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough waiting to happen. But few empaths understand this, and fewer still are prepared for what comes next when the shadow finally emerges from the depths of the unconscious, demanding its due after years of being ignored and suppressed. The damage begins long before the empath snaps. It spreads through their life like a slow-acting poison, corrupting everything it touches in ways so subtle that neither the empath nor those around them recognize what's happening until it's too late. The consequences aren't dramatic, they're insidious, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily existence until dysfunction becomes the new normal. Consider the neurological reality of what happens inside an empath's brain. Recent neuroscience research has revealed that people with high empathy show hyperactivation in their mirror neuron systems, the neural networks responsible for mimicking and understanding others' emotional states. But here's what the research doesn't emphasize. When these systems are constantly activated, they don't just mirror emotions, they hijack the empath's own emotional processing centers. The empath's brain literally rewires itself to prioritize others' feelings over their own. The anterior cingulate cortex, responsible for emotional regulation and decision-making, becomes so focused on external emotional input that it loses the ability to process internal emotional signals effectively. This isn't metaphorical, it's measurable brain damage caused by chronic emotional overextension. But the consequences extend far beyond the individual empath. They create what psychologists call systemic codependency, entire social networks that become dependent on the empath's emotional labor while simultaneously losing their own capacity for emotional self-regulation. The empath becomes the emotional immune system for everyone around them. And like any immune system that's overworked, it eventually starts attacking the very organism it's meant to protect. Watch how this plays out in the empath's relationships. Their partners never learn to manage their own emotions because the empath is always there to absorb, process, and neutralize their negative feelings. Their friends never develop resilience because the empath is always available to provide comfort and solutions. Their children never learn emotional independence because the empath anticipates and meets their every emotional need before they can even identify it themselves. This creates what cognitive psychologists call learned helplessness on a massive scale. The people in the empath's life become emotionally handicapped, unable to function without their constant emotional support. They develop what researchers term emotional outsourcing, the unconscious habit of delegating their emotional processing to someone else rather than developing their own emotional intelligence. The empath, meanwhile, becomes trapped in what's known as the caretaker's paradox. The more they help, the more helpless everyone around them becomes. The more they give, the more people need from them. The more they fix, the more broken people they attract. They become like a skilled surgeon who's so good at treating symptoms that they never address the underlying disease. Except in this case, their skill is actually creating more of the disease they're trying to cure. This is where the confirmation bias kicks in with devastating effect. The empath's worldview becomes organized around the belief that people are fundamentally helpless, that the world is full of suffering that only they can alleviate, that their worth depends on their ability to rescue others. Every broken person who enters their life confirms this belief. Every crisis they resolve reinforces their sense of indispensability. Every moment of gratitude they receive validates their identity as a savior. But what they don't see, what the confirmation bias prevents them from seeing, is how their constant intervention is actually creating the very problems they're solving. They don't notice that their children are less resilient than their peers, that their partners are less emotionally mature than other adults, that their friends are more dependent and less capable of handling normal life stresses. The empath becomes trapped in what systems theorists call a strange loop, a self-reinforcing cycle where their solution to the problem actually creates more of the problem, which then requires more of their solution, which creates even more of the problem. Ad infinitum. They become the emotional equivalent of a drug dealer who sincerely believes they're helping their customers by giving them what they need. This is where the cultural conditioning becomes truly insidious. Our society celebrates this dysfunction. We glorify the self-sacrificing mother, the endlessly giving friend, the therapist who never takes a day off. We call them heroes, saints, pillars of the community. We create an entire mythology around the nobility of suffering for others, never questioning the psychological cost or the systemic damage this creates. The empath internalizes this cultural narrative so completely that they can't imagine an alternative. They believe that setting boundaries is selfish, that saying no is cruel, that taking care of themselves is narcissistic. They've been so thoroughly conditioned to equate their worth with their usefulness that they literally cannot conceive of a life where they're valued for who they are rather than what they do for others. And so the damage compounds. The empath becomes increasingly depleted, increasingly resentful, increasingly isolated in their giving. They develop what psychologists call compassion fatigue, a condition where the capacity for empathy becomes so overextended that it begins to shut down entirely. Their nervous system, designed to handle occasional stress, becomes chronically dysregulated from constant emotional overload. The people around them, meanwhile, become increasingly entitled, increasingly demanding, increasingly unable to function without the empath's emotional support. They develop what could be called empathy dependency, an addiction to having someone else manage their emotional states for them. They lose touch with their own emotional resilience, their own capacity for self-soothing, their own ability to find meaning in their struggles. This is the hidden consequence that no one talks about. The empath's compulsive giving doesn't just damage them, it damages everyone it touches. It creates emotional invalids who can't function without constant support. It perpetuates a cycle of dependency that weakens the entire social fabric. It turns what should be mutual relationships into parasitic ones, where one person gives everything and everyone else takes everything. When the empath finally snaps, it's not just their own suppressed shadow that emerges, it's the collective shadow of everyone who has been enabled by their giving, everyone who has been robbed of their own emotional growth, everyone who has been turned into an emotional child by the empath's compulsive caretaking. The explosion that follows affects not just the empath, but the entire network of relationships that has been built on the foundation of their self-sacrifice. The path to freedom begins with a truth so radical that it will make you question everything you've been taught about compassion, kindness, and what it means to be a good person. Here it is. The greatest act of love an empath can perform is to stop loving in the way they've always loved. The most compassionate thing they can do is to become, by conventional standards, ruthlessly selfish. This isn't about becoming cruel or heartless. This is about recognizing that what the empath calls love is actually a sophisticated form of control, and what they call helping is actually a way of keeping people weak. The rebellion begins when the empath finally admits to themselves that their giving has been as much about their own psychological needs as it has been about helping others. Jung called this process individuation, the painful journey of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. For the empath, individuation means learning to disappoint people, to let them struggle with their own problems, to say no even when saying yes would be easier. It means developing what might seem like the most unnatural skill in the world, the ability to watch someone suffer without immediately rushing to fix it. This is where the real work begins. The empath must learn to distinguish between empathy and enmeshment, between compassion and codependency, between helping and enabling. They must develop what psychologists call differentiation, the ability to be emotionally present with someone without absorbing their emotional state, to care without carrying, to support without rescuing. The first step is what might be called emotional bankruptcy, the complete acknowledgement that their current way of being in the world is not sustainable. Just as a financial bankruptcy forces someone to restructure their entire relationship with money, emotional bankruptcy forces the empath to restructure their entire relationship with giving and receiving. This means stopping. Full stop. No more automatic yes. No more reflexive helping. No more absorbing other people's emotions like a sponge. The empath must learn to sit with the discomfort of other people's pain without immediately trying to alleviate it. They must learn to tolerate the anxiety of not being needed, the guilt of not being helpful, the fear of not being valued. Historical examples of this kind of radical transformation are found in the lives of people who broke free from similar patterns of compulsive giving. Consider the story of codependent no more author Melody Beattie, who had to learn that her constant rescuing of her alcoholic husband was actually enabling his addiction. Her breakthrough came when she realized that her love was keeping him sick, that her help was actually harm disguised as virtue. Or consider the Buddhist concept of idiot compassion, the kind of helping that actually harms both the giver and the receiver. The Dalai Lama teaches that sometimes the most compassionate act is to refuse to help, to force someone to find their own strength, to allow them to experience the consequences of their choices. This runs counter to everything the empath has been taught. but it's the key to breaking the cycle of codependency. The empath must learn to practice what might be called fierce love, love that is willing to be misunderstood, love that is willing to be called selfish, love that is willing to let people be angry rather than comfortable. This kind of love says, I care about you too much to enable your weakness. I love you too much to rob you of your own growth. I respect you too much to treat you like you're incapable of handling your own life. The practical application of this rebellion involves developing what psychologists call emotional boundaries, the ability to separate your emotional experience from others' emotional experiences. This means learning to say things like, I can see that you're upset, and I care about you, but I can't fix this for you. It means learning to sit with the discomfort of someone else's disappointment without immediately trying to make it better. The empath must also learn to practice what might be called strategic selfishness, the deliberate cultivation of their own needs, wants, and desires. This means asking themselves questions they've never asked before. What do I actually want? What do I need? What would make me happy? What are my dreams, separate from everyone else's problems? This is where the shadow work becomes crucial. The empath must learn to integrate all the parts of themselves they've rejected, the selfish parts, the angry parts, the parts that want to be cared for rather than always caring for others. They must learn to befriend their own neediness, their own hunger for attention, their own desire to be rescued sometimes. The rebellion also involves what might be called reverse empathy, learning to tune into their own emotional state with the same intensity they've always used to tune into others' emotional states. This means becoming exquisitely aware of their own feelings, their own needs, their own boundaries. It means treating their own emotional experience as sacred, as worthy of protection and care. Perhaps most importantly, the empath must learn to tolerate being disliked, misunderstood, even hated by the people they refuse to enable. When they stop being the emotional caretaker, when they stop absorbing everyone's problems, when they start saying no, the people around them will not celebrate this growth. They will resist it, fight it, try to guilt them back into their old patterns. The empath must understand that this resistance is not evidence that they're doing something wrong. It's evidence that they're doing something right. The people who have been dependent on their emotional labor will do everything in their power to maintain the status quo. They will call the empath selfish, cruel, heartless. They will threaten to leave, to never speak to them again, to tell everyone what a terrible person they become. This is the test. This is where the empath discovers whether they truly want to be free or whether they just want to complain about being trapped. The rebellion is not complete until the empath can hear these accusations and respond with something like, "You're right. I am being selfish. I am prioritizing my own needs. I am no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being for your comfort." And that's exactly what I need to do. The ultimate rebellion is the empath's willingness to be the villain in other people's stories rather than the hero in their own tragedy. It's the radical act of choosing their own life over everyone else's approval, their own growth over everyone else's comfort, their own authenticity over everyone else's expectations. Here is the truth that will shatter everything you thought you knew about empathy, compassion, and the nature of human connection. The empath's greatest fear is not that they will hurt others by setting boundaries. It's that they will discover they don't actually need others as much as they think they do. And their greatest terror is not that people will abandon them if they stop giving. It's that they will realize they've been abandoned all along, surrounded by people who loved what they could provide but never truly saw who they were. This is Jung's darkest warning made manifest. The empath has been living in a psychological prison of their own making, convinced that their cage is actually a sanctuary, that their chains are actually wings, that their slow emotional death is actually a noble life. The snap, when it comes, is not the breakdown of their empathy, it's the breakdown of their illusions about what their empathy has actually been accomplishing. The ultimate revelation is this: true empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice. Real compassion doesn't demand self-destruction. Authentic love doesn't need you to disappear in order to exist. The empath has been practicing what might be called empathy theater, a performance of caring so elaborate, so convincing, so total that they fooled even themselves into believing it's real. But here's what lies beneath the performance. A person so terrified of their own worthlessness that they've convinced themselves they only exist in relation to others' pain. A soul so convinced of its own inadequacy that it can only feel valuable when it's being useful. A heart so afraid of its own darkness that it's projected all its light onto others, leaving itself empty and hollow. The empath's compulsive giving is not about love, it's about fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of having to face the terrifying question of who they are when they're not needed. They've built their entire identity around being indispensable, not realizing that truly indispensable people are actually the most easily replaced because they've made themselves interchangeable with any other person willing to sacrifice themselves. The snap is the moment when this elaborate psychological structure collapses, when the empath finally sees through their own performance and recognizes the profound loneliness at the heart of their giving. It's the moment when they realize that they've been surrounded by people who never really knew them, who never asked about their dreams, who never wondered about their pain, who never thought to give back even a fraction of what they'd been given. This is where the true darkness of Jung's warning emerges. The empath discovers that they've been living in a world of emotional ghosts, surrounded by people who exist only as reflections of their own needs to be needed. They've been pouring their life force into relationships that were never actually relationships at all, but elaborate transactions where their love was the currency and others' dependency was the payment. The ultimate truth is that the empath's snap is not a moment of weakness. It's a moment of profound awakening. It's the moment when they finally see clearly, perhaps for the first time in their lives, the difference between being loved and being used, between being valued and being exploited, between being in relationship and being in service. And here's the most liberating realization of all. When the empath finally stops giving compulsively, when they finally set boundaries, when they finally start living for themselves instead of through others, they discover something miraculous. The people who truly love them don't leave. The relationships that are real don't end. The connections that matter don't dissolve when they're no longer based on the empath's self-sacrifice. What disappears are the ghosts, the emotional vampires, the people who were never really there in the first place. What remains are the rare and precious few who saw the person behind the performance, who valued the soul beneath the service, who loved the human being rather than the human doing. The empath's journey from snap to freedom is ultimately a journey from false self to true self, from performed love to authentic love, from empathy as prison to empathy as gift. They learn that healthy empathy is not about absorbing others' emotions, it's about witnessing them. It's not about fixing others' problems, it's about supporting their growth. It's not about being needed, it's about being present. This is the paradigm shift that changes everything. The empath realizes that their sensitivity is not a burden to be managed, but a superpower to be wielded consciously. Their ability to feel deeply becomes a gift they can offer from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, strength rather than weakness, choice rather than compulsion. The healed empath becomes what Jung called the wounded healer in its truest form, someone who has faced their own darkness and emerged whole, who can sit with others' pain without being consumed by it, who can offer genuine compassion without losing themselves in the process. They become living proof that it's possible to care deeply without caring compulsively, to love fully without loving desperately, to serve others without serving their own emotional needs. But perhaps the most profound truth of all is this: the empath's snap is not the end of their story, it's the beginning. It's the moment when they stop being the victim of their own compassion and start being the conscious creator of their own life. It's when they stop asking, "How can I help?" and start asking, "How can I live authentically while also serving the highest good?" The world doesn't need more empaths who give until they break. The world needs empaths who have learned to give from a place of overflow rather than emptiness, who have discovered that the most radical act of service is to become fully, authentically, unapologetically themselves. Because only then can they offer others not just their sympathy, but their strength, not just their understanding, but their wisdom, not just their presence, but their power. The day the empath snaps is the day they finally wake up. And once awake, they can never go back to sleep. The question is not whether you're ready for this awakening. The question is whether you're ready to live the life that waits for you on the other side of it.